Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you were watching a few weeks ago, you may recall that I released a layout design video where I went through the development of an HO scale railroad for a very awkward basement space. Well, this week I'm also presenting an HO scale layout design. In this case, the challenge was to fit a rather large Texas prototype into a rather awkward attic space. Now, when I initially recorded the raw footage for this video, I recorded almost 2 hours of it, and even with a lot of editing, it is still way too long for one video. So I will be splitting it up into 3 separate installments. In this first installment, I will go through the space available and what it was that the client wanted to include. So without further ado, let's get on with the design. For this week's video, I would like to present another layout design. This time it is for a fairly substantial HO scale layout. And although the end result was a very satisfying plan, it did look at the start as though it was going to be anything but that. Let me show you what I had to work with. Here is the architect's drawing of the upper floor of the customer's home. This area is open to his living room. Here is the upstairs family room, and that was supposed to be the site for the railroad. He'd already plotted the room in Third Planet, and he sent me the 3PI file, so let's dig that out. Here it is. It's upside down from the previous drawing. Here is the extent of his room, with the small squares being 12 inches. Now, that was a decent sized room. There is a pool table in the center, which he said cannot be moved. It needs to stay exactly where it is. There's a wet bar in the corner, which is built in. This area is for his desk, although the desk can be moved if necessary. This end of the room needs to be left largely open for TV watching. He has a widescreen TV here, and he was hoping that we could do an around the walls layout. Now, at first glance, it may look to an inexperienced designer that there is plenty of room to do just that. When I went through his questionnaire answers, it turns out that he wants a layout based on parts of a fairly large prototype. He wants an intermodal yard, he wants a huge grain elevator complex, long unit trains, a representation of a significant size engine terminal. The location escapes me right now, and he wanted another rural yard as well. And he wanted to be able to run 89-foot intermodal flats and multiple lash-ups of large modern diesels. He also wanted to be able to run a big boy on excursion trains. So obviously that requires large curves and long straight runs. Now, I started superimposing various things over this drawing. If you recall, I mentioned it was an attic room. These 2 rectangles that I've highlighted in the corners of the room represent areas of the ceiling that are less than 6 feet high. So we're basically not going to be able to use those areas on the upper deck of an upper deck layout. I also drew some circles representing the minimum size for a double track helix with a curved radius sufficient to run the trains that he wants to. Now, he did also mention that he thought there could be a removable peninsula resting on the pool table, which could be removed when he wanted to play pool. So I drew another circle here. I drew it around the end, since obviously it would hook up at this north wall by the window. I've made sure that it covers the corners so that you don't have problems with operators walking into the table when they're concentrating on their trains. So to allow for his double track main line to use the peninsula and curve back on itself, it would be a pretty large chunk of bench work, far too big and awkward to maneuver into place, and would probably result in either the railroad never being run or the pool table never being used. So more than likely, the best solution to that would be to arrange some kind of rope and pulley system just to lift it up out of the way and suspend it from the ceiling when not in use. But even so, the room had bigger problems than just this. Now, these 3 loops that I've drawn around the pool table represent the area that would have to be kept clear if anyone is to be able to play pool without destroying the railroad on the backswing. I wasn't quite sure how much he felt he needed. After all, I don't know how long his cues are. I'm not a pool fanatic myself. I drew the first one 3 feet from the table, then 3'6" and 4 foot. I suspect that the 4 foot is probably about where he needs the clearance point. And as we can see, although it does miss this helix here, it doesn't allow for anything along this wall or more than a few inches in front of the window. So pretty much the entire room is wiped out before we've got anything useful. And there is certainly nowhere that he can get any kind of workable yard. I suggested 3 possibilities. Either he was going to have to find a bigger room, or accept a smaller prototype, or switch to N scale. And when I initially sent out this email, I was a little concerned about how it would be received. I got a reply after a couple of days to say that he had decided to remodel the rest of his attic to give himself a generous size dedicated train room. So let's find those drawings. Here is a section from the architect's drawings that came back. So I immediately transferred all the dimensions to third planet and calculated the areas that were available to us. Let me find that drawing. Here is just the relevant area redrawn in third planet. Room entry is here. We have this L-shaped area. Because it's still attic, of course, the grey shaded areas represent those parts of the room that have less than a 6 foot headroom. Now this area here is an unfinished attic space. This is the HVAC system in the attic, and the floor is at a slightly higher elevation to allow for a cathedral ceiling in the bedroom below it. So although it wasn't going to be available for the main layout, we did think that it would be a good opportunity to use it as a staging area, to avoid the staging areas eating into the main layout space. Now it turns out that the floor joists in this area are not rated for loading, and I don't see that 1 or 2 operators walking in there occasionally is going to be very significant compared with the weight of the machinery that's already in there. The easiest thing to do was just to accept the ruling and to abandon this area altogether. Now it was fortunate that I checked all the dimensions thoroughly and calculated all the headrooms properly, because it turned out the architect had made a bit of a mistake in this area here. He had a 6'8" door specified for a wall that was only about 6'3" high. Here is the drawing that came back from the architect. He solved the problem here by moving the wall a couple of inches to where it was 6'6" high and specified a 6'4" door instead of a 6'8". Of course, it's still not right because it's only 6'6" at the front of the wall. It's only 6'3" at the back of the wall. So it's still not going to fit. He's going to have to trim it more. But at least I've pointed out the problem to him. What I'm not going to do is make a nuisance of myself and tell him how to do his job. I just hope he doesn't respond by moving this wall even further out, because we do need this area for the railroad. And if he comes any further this way, we'll end up losing one of the important industries. Now at this point, the customer expressed concerns that after taking away the parts of the room that had less than full headroom, there wasn't really a lot of space remaining for his railroad. So we asked the architect for a dormer at this end. So this is the drawing that came back with the dormer at this end. As we can see, it's almost the full width of the room. There's a small area cut out in this corner, and of course there is still a little area here which is less than 6 foot clearance. But we've got this whole extra area for the layout. It is now a much better space than he had before. I did ask him whether he wanted to add a dormer at the other end as well to improve the space still further, but I guess at this point he was already spending as much as he wanted to on the remodel, and dormers are not cheap. So let's now draw this revised space in third planet and see how best to fit the railroad that he wants into it. So here is the new site drawn in third planet. I've turned it around 90 degrees so it fits better on the screen that way. I started plotting with 3 foot minimum radius curves. These 2 circles here represent the double track main with a 3 foot radius on the inside track. And I've drawn it with 3 foot aisles throughout. This was my first general arrangement. So I call this one plan 1. And it looks like there's just about enough space for a second aisle with a narrow industrial scene along here, even though it won't be one of his signature scenes. But that might not be a good trade-off, because we might end up adding something that he doesn't particularly care for while compromising the signature scenes that he wants. So I redrew it with just a single aisle. There's a possibility of getting another loop in this corner. And when I drew this, I was thinking of the area around Cresson Yard, which will be on the lower deck, because just to the east of Cresson there is a Y, and this wide area here allows for the inclusion of that Y. Here I tried extending this end and wrapping it round to the middle of the room, but this doesn't really work. All this does is trades the long peninsula we had down the middle for a much shorter one. So I immediately discarded that. And then here is another version that I drew. Now, if you recall, we weren't 100% sure whether we were going to be able to use part of this room for staging. This plan here would only work if we're able to do that, because if you notice, there is no room for the other turn-back curve at the far end of the layout. But since we weren't certain of being able to use this area for anything at all, even a turn-back curve, we ended up going back to version 2, which is this one. So all the future designs were based on this footprint. Now, in common with all the other plans that I drew at this stage, they are very tight in the room. So I reduced the minimum radius slightly to 33 inches while keeping the minimum aisle at 36 inches. And with those new standards, everything fitted quite nicely. So before we start placing the various scenes in the room, let's take a look at what the client wanted to include. Let me find those scenes quickly. Okay, here is an aerial view of Cresson Yard. It's not a particularly large yard. I think it's 7 tracks wide, and there are a few other tracks around it. And just off of the picture here is the Y. Here it is. This is turned around. Cresson Yard is just off the top left corner. There's a very large lumber yard here, and several smaller industries, some inside the Y and some in front of it. And there's also another one off the screen at the bottom of the page. And as we can see, these areas are on a single track main line. There's another passing siding just off the picture here to the right. Here's a couple of examples of a small trestle that he wanted to include somewhere. And here is one of the signature scenes which he wanted. It's the bridge over Mustang Creek. Now this is between Cresson and Fort Worth, which was the other major area that he wanted to represent. And he wanted a small portion of Davison Yard in Fort Worth. This is just the engine servicing facilities. We have a large rectangular shop building between 2 sections of yard. Actually, these are mainly just the yard approaches. There's a huge hump yard just off to the left of this picture. But he wanted to capture the feel of this area here. And what I thought was important was to get the rectangular shop building placed across the axis of the main lines, with 2 sections of the yard, one either side. Now, just this area that is photographed here, if modelled to scale, it would exceed the size of his entire train room. So obviously, there's a lot of compression needed. And here is another bridge area just to the east of the last picture that I showed you. There are the 4 tracks approaching the yard over a river with multiple road bridges. And there are considerably more further off this picture to the northwest. And I actually worked out that to model all the bridges at the correct width, we would need benchwork more than 8 feet wide. And clearly that wasn't going to be an option. So again, this is somewhere that we were going to have to compromise on. Here are some other scenes that he wanted. There's 2 photographs of the Saginaw grain elevator complex just north of Fort Worth, and an intermodal yard that he wanted to represent part of as well. So let's go back to our drawing and see how we can best represent all these areas within the space that he has available. Well, that is all for this week. Next week I will set about fitting this prototype into the confines of the space available. Until then, don't go away. I will see you next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.